By late 1944, as the Allied advance tore through Western Europe, the U.S. Army found itself processing tens of thousands of captured German soldiers. Among them were nurses, signal auxiliaries, clerks, anti-aircraft assistants, women in uniform who had served the Reich's expanding war machine. They were young, disciplined, and exhausted, and they were now prisoners of the United States Army.
The transport logs from Camp Ashwood, one of dozens of American-operated internment facilities, record the arrival of another prisoner convoy at 0630. Rain mixed with early frost. The German prisoners, cold, hungry, and uncertain of their fate, were marched through the gates under standard security formation. 2 MP escorts for every 20 captives. Among the column walks our protagonist, carrying a worn field pack, boots caked with mud, Wehrmacht auxiliary insignia still sewn to her sleeve. Her eyes take in the guard towers, the razor wire, the shouting of NCOs giving orders. The American system is strict, efficient, and unfamiliar. For the prisoners, processing began immediately. Personal effects were catalogued, contraband confiscated. Each prisoner underwent medical inspection and was assigned a barracks unit and work detail. The camp's internal regulations were delivered in clear terms: no escape attempts, no sabotage, no refusal of labor. Violations would bring disciplinary action under the Geneva Convention and U.S. Army protocols. American prisoner camps were run according to the book: daily roll call, labor assignments, controlled movement between sectors. But there was also a strange calm. Compared to bombed-out Europe, these camps could feel almost orderly, even safe.
Inside the wire, routine became the backbone of survival. Reveille at 0530, muster at 0000, breakfast in the mess, powdered eggs, black coffee, rationed bread. By 0700, work columns assembled for transport to farms, warehouses, or camp maintenance units. In the barracks, the protagonist rolls out a U.S. Army-issue cot blanket, folding it with practiced precision. Around her, quiet conversations in German mix with the echo of boots moving along the concrete floors. For many German prisoners, life in the American camps held an unfamiliar predictability. Food was regular, beatings rare. Discipline professional. The war was still raging across the Atlantic, but here, behind American wire, survival depended less on ideology and more on routine. Yet beneath that routine lay fear. Fear of the unknown, of letters from home that never arrived, of rumors about the Eastern Front, of whispered stories about the Gestapo waiting for anyone who appeared too willing to cooperate with the Americans. And for one prisoner, this camp, this isolated patch of American soil, would become the beginning of a story no one could have predicted.
The American soldier first noticed her during a routine perimeter check, though he would never admit it aloud. To him, it was simply another shift, another slow walk along the wire, counting heads and watching for trouble. The winter air bit at his face, the kind of cold that made a man focus on his job just to stay awake. He had served long enough to know discipline was the heart of Army life. His uniform was worn from months in the field, the dull green fabric faded by mud and sun. Like many American soldiers assigned to stateside duty after overseas rotations, he carried the quiet fatigue of men who had seen more than they preferred to remember. From his post, he studied the German prisoners with trained indifference. They lined up for roll call, adjusting their coats, murmuring in low voices. Yet something about this woman set his eyes still for a moment. She stood at attention with a kind of precise composure, chin lifted, shoulders squared. There was nothing dramatic about her presence, just discipline, the kind drilled into anyone who had worn a uniform long enough. But she carried it with a calm that drew his attention despite himself. He forced his gaze away. Fraternization rules weren't suggestions. A soldier caught getting too familiar with a prisoner risked disciplinary charges and reassignment. He reminded himself of this with the mechanical certainty of a man who knew the army didn't tolerate lapses in judgment.
Still, as he continued his patrol, stray thoughts crept in. He wondered what branch she had served in, what tasks she had been trained for, what turmoil had brought her across continents to this fenced-in patch of American soil. He didn't dwell on these questions. He pushed them aside, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of boots on frozen ground. Around him, the camp moved with predictable order, trucks delivering supplies, guards exchanging brief words as shifts changed, the faint clatter of tools from the maintenance yard. Nothing about the day should have stood out. He was a soldier doing his duty in a place designed to feel the same every morning. But as he passed her again later, this time near the camp's work detail assembly, he sensed a brief flicker of eye contact. Not a stare, not something bold or dangerous, just a moment of accidental acknowledgement between two uniforms on opposite sides of a war. He looked away first. Regulations were clear, and he lived by them. But even he couldn't fully silence the quiet thought forming at the back of his mind. How strange it was that in a world torn apart by conflict, a simple glance could feel more unsettling than artillery fire. He cleared his throat, adjusted the sling of his rifle, and continued his circuit. The army expected vigilance, not curiosity. And yet, as he resumed his watch, he already knew that this prisoner, faceless hours earlier, had become someone he would notice again, whether he liked it or not. The first time she spoke to him, it wasn't anything remarkable. No exchange of names, no dramatic moment, just a practical question delivered in careful English. It happened early in the morning, while the work detail formed near the motor pool. The prisoners stood in a loose line, adjusting gloves and fastening coats while the American guards checked rosters. He stood a few paces off, pencil tucked behind his ear, clipboard in hand, overseeing the assembly with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before. She stepped forward, holding out a small metal tag with her work detail number. Her English carried the clipped precision of someone who had learned it from textbooks, not conversation. "Is this the correct group for the warehouse labor?" she asked. He turned toward her, surprised by the directness. Most prisoners spoke little unless asked a question. He nodded, taking the tag and glancing at the number. "Yeah," he said, clearing his throat. "You're in the right place." She nodded once and stepped back into formation. It was nothing, just a routine confirmation. But her composure, the steady way she held herself despite the cold and despite being surrounded by armed men, stayed with him longer than it should have. Later that day, he found himself watching the warehouse from a distance
as the prisoners sorted crates of rations. She moved with quiet precision, lifting, stacking, organizing with an efficiency that reminded him of military drill. He told himself he was observing the detail for security reasons, nothing more. But the truth was more complicated. And he wasn't the only one who noticed.
German auxiliaries are always neat workers, one of the older sergeants muttered beside him. Makes the logistics boys happy. He gave a non-committal grunt, eyes still following her movements. The next conversation happened almost by accident. During a brief break, she approached the water barrel placed near the entrance, where he stood monitoring the perimeter. She filled her cup, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "You speak slower than most," she said. "It makes it easier to understand." He blinked. "I wasn't aware I did." "It is not an insult," she added quickly. "Most Americans talk fast. Too fast for me." He almost laughed, but caught himself. "Well, I'll keep that in mind." She gave a faint nod and returned to her task. He watched her go, wondering why such a simple exchange felt like stepping across an invisible line. Days passed. The winter eased, leaving the camp wrapped in a wet, gray thaw. He continued his duties, walking perimeter routes, checking rosters, supervising details. And she continued hers, quietly smoothing out the chaos of military storage rooms. Their interactions grew slowly, like a pattern forming without intention. Sometimes she would ask the meaning of a word she overheard from the guards. He would explain the purpose of certain equipment in the warehouse. Once she mispronounced screwdriver, and he corrected her gently. She repeated it more confidently, as if cataloging it among dozens of new terms. He told himself it was nothing unusual. Communication was necessary for work efficiency.
And yet he found himself anticipating their conversations, however brief. Her manner was different from many other prisoners. She didn't plead, didn't flatter, didn't shrink. She simply spoke when it was appropriate, as if trying to navigate the boundaries of a place she did not choose to be. One late afternoon, as the work detail was dismissed and the prisoners filed back toward the barracks, she paused near him. Snowflakes drifted lightly in the cold air, settling on her hair and coat. She brushed one away and asked, almost casually, "Do you miss home?" He stiffened at the unexpected question. "Sometimes," he said, "but soldiers don't talk about that much." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Prisoners don't either," she said softly. She left him standing there, the unspoken weight of her words drifting with the snow. After that day, something unspoken shifted. Still no smiles, no familiarity, just a quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding that existed beneath the surface. They remained bound by uniforms, orders, and the steel wire that separated them. But the conversations, however mundane, began forming a fragile connection neither had intended. And though he never would have admitted it, to the sergeants, to his fellow guards, or even to himself, he had started to know the sound of her voice before she even spoke.
Spring crept into the camp like a cautious intruder, mud replacing frost, distant thunder replacing the sharp crack of winter wind. With it came whispers, drifting through the barracks and across the guard posts. The war in Europe was collapsing. Germany was close to surrender. Rumors spread faster than official bulletins ever could. For the prisoners, these rumors changed everything. For the guards, Especially him, they changed the air he breathed. Suddenly, every conversation felt heavier, as if time itself were running out. Each morning, when she joined the work detail, he noticed the shift in her demeanor. She still worked with the same quiet thoroughness, but her eyes searched the horizon more often, as though something out there, beyond the wire, was calling her attention. One afternoon, as she sorted supply crates in the warehouse, he told her what he had heard. "They say the German front is breaking apart," he said, keeping his voice low. "Major cities collapsing. Maybe days, maybe weeks." She didn't stop working. She set a crate down carefully, aligning it with mathematical precision. "I have heard the same," she said. But her voice carried a slight tremor, one she tried to hide behind discipline. He stood beside her for a moment, unsure whether to speak. He wasn't supposed to show concern. A guard was a guard. A prisoner was a prisoner. But war had a way of blurring lines men once believed were solid as steel. "Are you worried?" he asked finally.
She didn't look at him. "Worried is not the right word," she said softly. "Whatever waits in Germany, I have no control over it." Outside the warehouse, a truck backfired, startling several prisoners. She flinched too, just barely. He noticed. Later that week, the camp commander posted new orders. With Germany on the brink of surrender, preparations began for large-scale repatriation. Most prisoners welcomed the idea. Home was home, regardless of conditions. But for her, the news seemed to strike like a blow. Returning home meant facing a nation in ruins, cities pulverized, families scattered. But it meant something else too, something she didn't speak of openly. Many Germans feared returning under suspicion of disloyalty. Any hint of cooperation with the enemy, even imagined, could follow them. He didn't ask her directly, he didn't dare, but he sensed the tightening weight in her shoulders each day the rumors grew louder. Restrictions in the camp tightened. Guards were ordered to keep stricter professional distance. Any personal conversation was now explicitly forbidden, punishable under Army disciplinary code. The officers feared escapes, unrest, or fraternization as old lines redrew themselves across the world. One morning, as she joined the work detail, he barely nodded at her. Not out of coldness, but out of caution. She seemed to understand. But for the first time, he felt something sharp in her gaze. Disappointment or worry, he couldn't tell. By midday, the tension had grown unbearable.
As she organized inventory inside a depot building, she quietly spoke without looking at him. "Is it true?" she asked. "Are we being sent back soon?" He hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. "It's only a matter of time." She exhaled slowly. "I see." A long silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of generators and the rasp of boots outside. He looked at her then, the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her fingers lingered an extra second on the edge of a crate as though grounding herself. She had never looked fragile before, not once. Yet the uncertainty gnawed at her with a quiet persistence. "You don't want to go back," he said. It wasn't a question. She closed her eyes briefly. "It is not about wanting or not wanting. Germany is not the place I left, and I do not know what I would return to." She paused, voice tightening. "Or who?"
He felt something twist in his chest. "You survived a war," he said. "You'll survive the aftermath." "Survival," she murmured, "is not the same as living." The statement hung between them, heavy with meaning he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. As the day ended and the prisoners lined up to march back to the barracks, he watched her from his post. She moved with the same disciplined stride, but every step carried a weight that hadn't been there weeks earlier. He wanted to speak to her again, anything to offer a sliver of assurance, but the new regulations glared in his mind. 2 guards had already been reprimanded for being overly conversational. Duty, orders, distance. These were the pillars of military life. But as he stood there, tightening his grip on the rifle sling, he realized something unspoken but undeniable. The thought of her leaving the camp, leaving the country, left a hollow feeling deep in his chest, one he hadn't felt in years of deployments. War stripped many things from people. Sometimes it stole identities, families, or entire cities. And sometimes, without warning, it stole the chance to say the words a person never knew they needed to say. He watched her disappear into the fading light, swallowed by the march of uniforms. And for the first time since he had donned a soldier's coat, he felt powerless. The order came down not with ceremony, but with a blunt announcement pinned to the bulletin board outside the administrative hut. Repatriation directives for all German POWs. Effective immediately. Transport units assigned. Departure dates scheduled. It was the kind of notice that jolted the prisoners into silent rows, reading the same lines over and over, each one confirming what they had dreaded or anticipated in equal measure. The handwriting was precise, the wording impersonal. The consequences were neither. When she read it, her face remained composed, but her fingers tightened around the paper, turning the edges white. He saw the reaction from a short distance away and felt a pressure rise in his chest. Frustration, helplessness, something burning he couldn't name. He wasn't supposed to linger near the board. He wasn't supposed to read their expressions like they mattered. But in that moment, he couldn't force himself to look away. That evening, the atmosphere inside the camp changed. The usual murmur of prisoners talking after roll call shifted into something rawer: speculation, fear, relief, grief. Some smiled, believing they'd soon see familiar streets again. Others stared at the floor or at distant memories. She sat on the lower bunk of her barracks cot, silent while the women around her argued about food shortages, rumors of destroyed cities, stories of families vanished in the bombings. No one had accurate news, only fragments carried from one continent to another by war's relentless chaos. She folded her hands in her lap, staring at the wooden floorboards. Home. Germany. The place she had once known. Now only a shadow. He lay awake in his own quarters, unable to sleep. The barracks walls felt closer than usual, the cot harder. Soldiers around him snored, murmured, shifted, utterly unaware of the storm inside him. He had faced artillery barrages that shook the earth, seen friends fall on foreign soil, yet nothing had ever left him so unmoored as the knowledge that she would soon be taken away, beyond any reach. The next day, he found her at the warehouse, performing her tasks with mechanical precision. She didn't speak at first,
Neither did he. The air between them felt different now, charged, fragile, threaded with everything they hadn't said. "You saw the notice," he finally said, though it was obvious. "Yes," she replied simply. He wanted to say something comforting, but comfort was not in the Army manual. Orders were orders. The U.S. government would not keep former enemy personnel on American soil. War didn't allow exceptions for human feeling. "How soon?" he asked. "A week," she answered. "Maybe less." Her voice held steady, but he caught the faint crack beneath it. He stepped closer than regulations permitted, though not enough to draw attention. "You're afraid," he said quietly. She lifted her chin. One is allowed fear in war. He didn't disagree. For a long moment they stood there in the dim warehouse, wooden crates stacked high, the scent of machine oil lingering in the air, shadows cutting across the concrete floor. Everything around them felt immovable, except for the truth pressing at both their throats. They were running out of time.
That evening, as the prisoners lined up for muster, the sergeant read off names for transport processing. When he called hers, her head lifted just slightly, but she didn't break formation. Her discipline never wavered, even as the words registered like a sentence. When the line dispersed, she approached him. It was against rules, but the whole camp was tense enough that no one paid much attention to a brief exchange. "I do not know what waits for me in Germany," she said quietly, "but I know what I leave behind here." He swallowed hard. "This place?" he asked. "The safety? The food? The quiet?" Her eyes met his, steady, honest. "No," she said. "You." He felt the words hit him like an unexpected blow. Silent, devastating, irreversible. He opened his mouth to respond. Anything. But footsteps approached. Another guard. An officer. He snapped back into military posture, and she quickly stepped away, returning to the line. The next days passed in a blur of preparation. Prisoners received new clothing, signed repatriation documents, were examined by Army doctors. He watched the process unfold from a distance, every sight a reminder of what he could not stop. On her final morning in the camp, she boarded the transport truck with the others, climbing into the back without looking back. He stood near the gate, rifle slung over his shoulder, trying to appear indifferent. But as the truck engine rumbled to life, she turned her head just slightly, her eyes searching through the wooden slats. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second. It was nothing the Army could punish, nothing anyone else would have noticed. But to him, it felt like the last thread between them stretching thin, ready to snap. The convoy pulled away, tires cutting deep into the muddy road, disappearing down the long path toward the rail station. The gates swung closed behind it with a metallic clang. He stood there long after the engines faded. War had taken many things from him, but this loss felt different, quieter, sharper, the kind of loss that left a man wondering if fate could be changed or if some battles were never meant to be fought with weapons at all. She was gone, and the silence she left behind lingered like smoke long after the last truck vanished from sight. Following the mass repatriations of German prisoners in the months after the European armistice, many former detainees returned to a homeland drastically altered by the final phase of the war. In countless towns and cities, civilian infrastructure was damaged or destroyed. Food supplies were inconsistent, and communication networks were unreliable. For many, Including her, the transition from the order of American-run internment facilities to the instability of post-war Germany was abrupt. Archival records from the period show that returning personnel often faced immediate challenges: securing housing, locating surviving relatives, obtaining ration cards, and navigating local administrative structures that were themselves disrupted by occupation authorities and shifting political oversight. These conditions shaped the first months of her life after returning from the United States. She settled temporarily in a community that had sustained heavy wartime damage, relying on provisional assistance and labor assignments issued by local authorities. Meanwhile, in the United States, soldiers who had served as guards or administrative personnel in POW camps resumed pre-war occupations, pursued education through the GI Bill, or remained in military service. He returned to civilian life, but records indicate that many former soldiers maintained curiosity about the fate of the German prisoners they had encountered, particularly those with whom they had regular daily interaction. The end of the war did not dissolve the personal impressions left by those months of routine contact. Communication between former prisoners and American personnel was strictly regulated. Direct correspondence was difficult due to postal censorship, international delays, and the complicated logistics of re-establishing mail routes. Yet, like many individuals separated by the war's end, they attempted to maintain limited contact through formal channels. Letters, when they succeeded in reaching their destinations, were often delayed by weeks or months. Much of the early post-war correspondence focused on basic information: health, living conditions, prospects for employment, and general stability.
As months passed, another challenge emerged: immigration law. In the immediate post-war years, German nationals faced significant restrictions when attempting to enter the United States. Security screenings, quota limits, and political considerations shaped the process. Anyone seeking entry was required to navigate a system designed to be cautious, deliberate, and often slow-moving. For former POWs, the path was even narrower. Records from the late 1940s show that many attempted immigration through sponsorship programs, labor opportunities, or marriage petitions. Each route required extensive documentation, character affidavits, and vetting by both American and Allied occupation authorities. It is within this environment that her attempts to return to the United States began. Local offices in post-war Germany forwarded her applications to American consulates, where they entered a lengthy review process. Investigators examined her background, wartime duties, and conduct as a prisoner. Any irregularity, missing papers, unclear service records, disputed residence could delay the case indefinitely. On the American side, he began a parallel effort. Veterans frequently reached out to congressional representatives or state offices for information on visa sponsorship. Letters from this period demonstrate the persistence required to navigate the bureaucracy, and his efforts were consistent with the experiences of many other veterans attempting to aid displaced civilians. For both parties, progress was slow. At times, months passed without any update. Post-war Europe was still reorganizing itself, and American immigration offices were overwhelmed by thousands of petitions. Yet despite the delays, her case remained active. A file moved gradually from desk to desk, from one office to another, across 2 continents.
By the late 1940s, the Displaced Persons Act opened additional pathways for European civilians seeking entry to the United States. Although the act primarily served refugees from Eastern Europe, certain German applicants were processed under its broader administrative provisions. Her application eventually entered this expanded framework, though not without additional scrutiny.
What occurred during this period was not dramatic in a cinematic sense, but it was characteristic of countless post-war stories. Persistence, waiting, uncertainty, and the slow machinery of two governments attempting to rebuild and reorganize after unprecedented conflict. Her future depended not on a decisive moment, but on the gradual accumulation of approvals, signatures, and verifications, the kind of bureaucratic process that shapes real history far more often than dramatic events. By the time her paperwork finally approached the final stage, several years had passed since the gates of the POW camp had closed behind her. The war was over. Europe was reshaping itself, and the United States was entering a new era. Yet the administrative trail created during these years would soon lead both of them toward an outcome neither had foreseen during their time on opposite sides of the wire.
When her immigration case was finally approved, it reflected the cumulative effect of years of administrative processing, background verification, and shifting policies that gradually allowed certain German nationals to enter the United States. Passenger manifests from the period show numerous individuals arriving under similar circumstances: former auxiliaries, displaced civilians, and applicants sponsored by American citizens or veterans. She became one among many whose post-war trajectory crossed the Atlantic in this era of reconstruction. Her departure from Germany followed the standard procedures established for westbound civilian travel. She underwent an additional medical examination, received temporary identification documents from the Allied authorities, and boarded a transport vessel operating under international civilian service. The journey was not luxurious. Vessels repurposed in the post-war years were often crowded, utilitarian, and structured around basic provisions. Yet, compared to the conditions she had faced in the final phase of the war, the voyage represented stability and the possibility of long-term security. While she traveled, he had already made arrangements to meet her on arrival. Veterans of the war were scattered across the country by this time, pursuing employment, education, or family life. His efforts to track her immigration status had required persistence, requests for updates from immigration offices, correspondence with port authorities, and travel logistics. Nothing about the process was immediate, but ultimately his preparations aligned with her scheduled arrival. Archival accounts of post-war ports describe scenes typical of the period: ships docking slowly, passengers examined by immigration officials, tags attached to luggage, relatives and sponsors waiting behind controlled entry barriers. The United States, transitioning into its early Cold War posture, maintained strict oversight of all newcomers. Individuals arriving from Germany underwent final interviews, document checks, and verification of sponsorship before clearance was granted. Her entry followed this protocol. Upon disembarking, she passed through immigration processing, where her case file, containing records from both the occupation authorities in Germany and the U.S. consular offices, was reviewed for the last time. Approval granted her the legal right to remain in the United States as an immigrant under the terms of the visa she had obtained.
Only after these formalities were completed did she step beyond the controlled area of the port. Contemporary reports from the era note that many reunions between immigrants and sponsors were understated, shaped by the fatigue of long travel, the constraints of official oversight, and the practical concerns of relocating to a new country. In her case, the meeting was the result of years of administrative effort and interrupted correspondence from opposite sides of a global conflict. From the port, the next stage was integration into civilian American life, housing, employment, and navigation of a society markedly different from the one she had left years earlier. Post-war America was experiencing rapid economic expansion, suburban development, and increasing reliance on veterans' benefits programs. For immigrants from Germany, the adjustment could be lengthy, influenced by language barriers, lingering wartime sentiments, and cultural differences. Her arrival, therefore, was not a conclusion, but the beginning of a new transitional period. Documentation from the time shows many former European civilians taking modest work initially, learning local customs, and gradually becoming part of American communities. Some facing suspicion, others welcomed, most simply working to establish a stable life. Her reunion with the former soldier who had known her during the war occurred within this broader historical context. A period defined not by dramatic moments, but by steady, practical steps taken by thousands of individuals reconstructing their futures after the upheavals of global conflict. The United States she entered was peaceful, orderly, and economically strong. Yet for someone whose adult life had been shaped by war and captivity, it represented both an unfamiliar environment and a significant turning point. Her presence on American soil marked the continuation of a story shaped by policy, persistence, and the unpredictable personal connections formed during wartime service.
Following her arrival in the United States, her immediate focus, like that of many post-war immigrants, was establishing stability. Housing, employment, and access to community resources defined the early months. Federal and state records from the late 1940s indicate that European immigrants, including former German nationals, frequently relied on sponsorship networks, veterans' families, and local refugee assistance organizations to secure initial accommodations. These programs provided temporary housing, guidance on legal registration, and access to public services. Employment opportunities were often limited for newcomers. Many European women with labor experience in wartime industries or administrative roles were initially placed in factory work, clerical positions, or domestic service, according to government labor reports. Language acquisition was a critical component of integration. Community programs and public school systems offered English instruction, although support was inconsistent and largely dependent on local resources. Adjusting to American work culture, social norms, and the legal system presented additional challenges, particularly for those whose formative adult years had been spent in military-controlled environments. Her connection with the former American soldier provided both a practical and social bridge. Documentation from similar cases shows that veterans often assisted immigrant acquaintances with navigating employment, housing, and legal procedures. Sponsorship could facilitate access to resources, reduce bureaucratic delays, and provide social guidance during the adaptation process.
In her case, this network enabled her to secure housing and employment more rapidly than many other new arrivals, although she still faced the common obstacles of cultural adaptation and lingering wartime stigma.
The legal pathway to permanent residence and eventual naturalization required strict adherence to immigration and citizenship regulations. Applications had to demonstrate continuous lawful residence, good moral character, and an understanding of U.S. civics. Historical records demonstrate that the process could span several years, with delays caused by administrative backlogs, documentation verification, and background checks, particularly for individuals originating from countries formerly at war with the United States. Compliance with these requirements was critical for long-term stability and eventual citizenship. Social adjustment extended beyond employment and legal procedures. Former German nationals entering American communities often encountered varied responses. Some individuals and organizations expressed openness and assistance, while others maintained suspicion or avoided interaction due to lingering wartime associations. Reports from post-war sociological studies note that successful integration depended on a combination of personal adaptability, social networks, and institutional support. Community participation, employment stability, and legal compliance collectively shaped the pathway toward citizenship. By the early 1950s, records indicate that she had achieved regular employment, maintained lawful residence, and participated in structured community activities, reflecting broader trends observed among post-war European immigrants. These developments were facilitated by structured support from veterans, local agencies, and federal programs designed to manage the influx of displaced persons and war-affected populations.
The process of naturalization, completed several years later, reflected both the formal legal requirements and the cumulative effect of her adaptation to American society. Citizenship records from the period emphasize the importance of residence, conduct, and integration, rather than prior wartime experience or nationality. Her case was ultimately consistent with other post-war immigrants who successfully transitioned from temporary residency to full citizenship, illustrating the systematic procedures and long-term outcomes characteristic of post-war immigration policy. By the mid-1950s, she had fully integrated into American society, establishing a permanent residence, legal status, and social networks. Historical documentation places such cases within the broader context of post-war reconstruction. Individuals displaced by global conflict, assisted by veterans or sponsors, navigated administrative structures, adapted to new social environments, and ultimately achieved long-term stability in the United States.
Once she had established residence and employment in the United States, the next step in her personal integration was formalized through marriage to the American soldier she had known during the war. Archival records from post-war immigration and naturalization files indicate that marriage between U.S. citizens and foreign nationals was one of the recognized pathways for legal residence and eventual citizenship, provided that the union met federal requirements and was verified through documentation. Marriage registration required compliance with state laws. Certificates had to be filed with local civil authorities, identification and age verification submitted, and in some cases, affidavits confirming eligibility and consent obtained.
Historical records show that marriages between American veterans and former European nationals were increasingly common in the late 1940s and early 1950s, particularly among individuals who had maintained correspondence during and after military service. These marriages often served both social and legal functions, establishing personal households and facilitating the immigration and naturalization processes.
By the late 20th century, she had established a permanent life in the United States. Census and local records from her community indicate that she lived in a suburban area typical of post-war American development, characterized by single-family homes, schools, and community organizations. Her residence reflected decades of stability and integration, shaped by her successful navigation of post-war immigration, marriage, and naturalization processes. Her husband, the American soldier she had known during the war, passed away several years prior, according to local records and family accounts. His death marked the conclusion of a shared chapter that had begun in circumstances defined by global conflict, internment, and bureaucratic separation. Despite his passing, the long-term structures of their life together, the home, family connections, and social networks remained intact.
Her story is emblematic of broader post-war experiences. Individuals displaced by global conflict, navigating complex legal, social, and bureaucratic processes to create stability, family life, and integration in a new country. The combination of marriage, legal procedures, personal persistence, and community support allowed her to transition from a prisoner of war to a full participant in American society. Today, she continues to reside in the United States, maintaining a private but active life. She visits Germany periodically, engages with local organizations and family networks, and reflects on a lifetime shaped by displacement, adaptation, and personal resilience. Her experience illustrates how post-war immigration pathways, veteran sponsorship, and legal frameworks facilitated successful integration, transforming former wartime separation into a story of lasting connection and adaptation.